morning I realized my son had stolen my house. I was standing at my kitchen window watching him pull into my driveway like he already owned the place. Which technically, he believed he did. Todd climbed out of his pickup truck. A new one, I noticed, black with chrome trim that caught the Tennessee sun at 9 in the morning. And he wasn't alone. The man beside him wore a polo shirt with a company logo on the breast pocket and carried a clipboard. A property manager. My son had brought a property manager to my house. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. Todd spotted me through the window and lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in that lazy half-wave he'd been doing since he was a teenager. Then he smiled. Not a good smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes the game is already finished and he's just showing up to collect. I pushed open the screen door and stepped out onto the front porch. Dad. He said it the way you'd say it to someone who had lost the argument 3 days ago and simply hadn't accepted it yet. Glad you're up. This is Weston. He pointed to the man with the clipboard. He manages properties for Whitmore Holdings. We figured we'd come by this morning and start talking about next steps. Next steps. I stood there in my slippers and my old flannel shirt, 64 years old, and my son was standing at the edge of my driveway, talking to me about next steps on a property I had paid off in 2011. I looked at Weston with his clipboard. I looked at my son with his new truck and his careful, practiced confidence, and then I said the only thing that mattered. Does Weston know the deed he's managing is legally void? Todd's smile flickered. It took a moment, like a fluorescent bulb when the ballast is going, that brief, ugly hesitation before the light either holds or dies. He opened his mouth. I turned around and walked back inside. My name is Harvey Cresswell. I'm 64 years old. I spent 35 years as a certified real estate appraiser in the state of Tennessee, the last 12, as a senior examiner with the Tennessee Board of Certified Real Estate Appraisers. I have read more title documents, deed transfers, and property conveyances than most county clerks see across an entire career. I know what fraud looks like buried in a stack of legal paper the way a cardiologist knows what a bad EKG looks like. The irregularity is plain once you've trained your eye to see it. My wife Louise passed in the spring of 2019, 7 months after her diagnosis with pancreatic cancer. We'd been married 38 years. She's the reason I built what I built on this land. 2.5 acres on the eastern edge of Brentwood, south of Nashville, a white colonial with a wrap-around porch she had wanted since, before we had money enough to afford the dream of it. I planted the dogwood trees along the fence line the same summer she planted the kitchen herb garden. The house cost us everything we had at the time and grew into something worth far more than either of us had imagined. After she was gone, I did what I've always done when something breaks. I assessed the damage, identified the vulnerabilities, and protected what remained. I contacted an estate planning firm in Franklin, one I'd worked with professionally for years on probate appraisal cases, and I had every square foot of this property transferred into an irrevocable asset protection trust. I named a corporate fiduciary as sole trustee. I made myself the occupant and income beneficiary for the remainder of my life. I did it because over 3.5 decades in real estate, I had watched too many widowed retirees lose property to decisions made in the fog of grief. I was not going to be one of them. I never mentioned it to Todd. That was the best decision I ever made. Welcome to Spoken Vengeance. If you've found this channel, you already know that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you build yourself, piece by piece, in the quiet, while the people who wronged you believe you're finished. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close. What happened began 11 months ago on a Sunday evening in October, when Todd and his wife Dana showed up at my door without calling ahead. I remember I was watching a football game, a low-stakes mid-season matchup I had on more for the noise than anything else. The doorbell rang twice in quick succession, and when I opened the door, both of them were standing on the porch, looking like they'd driven 2 hours in the rain, which they had. Todd's jaw was set the way it gets when he's trying to project control he doesn't quite have. Dana stood beside him, with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes red at the edges. I let them in without asking a question. That's what fathers do. I made a fresh pot of coffee and got them settled at the kitchen table. Dana wrapped both hands around her mug and stared into it. Todd sat with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped and started talking. The story went like this. his contracting company. He'd built a mid-size residential construction outfit over 10 years and was genuinely proud of it. Was facing a lawsuit from a former business partner who claimed Todd had pushed him out without fair compensation. The lawsuit had triggered a preliminary injunction freezing Todd's business accounts and his personal assets. Legal costs were bleeding through his reserves. The bank that held his business line of credit was threatening to call the balance by end of the month, and without a substantial collateral injection to secure an emergency bridge loan, the company would fold inside 2 weeks. House gone, kids' accounts gone, everything. He laid it out plainly, with no theatrics, and that made it more convincing rather than less. Todd had never been a crier. That was Dana's assignment at that table. She reached across and took my hand. Her fingers were ice cold, even through the warmth of the mug she'd been holding. She looked up at me and her eyes filled slowly, and she said, her voice breaking on the last word, "We have nowhere else to go, Harvey. Every door we've tried is shut. The banks won't extend anything while his assets are frozen. We're going to lose everything we've built." She paused, drew a careful breath. "I keep thinking about what Louise would want," she said quietly. "You know she'd tell you to help us. She made you promise to look after this family." Louise's name landed the way it always does. Like a key turning in a lock I keep bolted from the inside. My wife had loved Dana, had called her the daughter she'd always wanted, had held my hand in that hospital room and asked me, in the particular way she had of asking things she needed me to carry, to look after all of them. I did not recognize in that moment that Dana understood exactly which door that key opened. I offered my liquid savings, told them I'd liquidate part of my investment portfolio and write them a personal check large enough to cover the immediate crisis. Todd shook his head. Cash wouldn't satisfy the bank's requirements, he explained. What the lender needed was a hard asset, real property, appearing on his company's books as secured backing. Not ownership, he was quick to clarify. A management transfer. Temporary, a formality to show the bank examiner there was solid collateral behind the loan request. He slid a single page across the table. It described something called a Family Asset Management LLC. He'd had his attorney draft it, he said, specifically to accomplish 2 things. Stabilize his company in the short term and protect my estate from Tennessee inheritance taxes over the long term. By parking the management rights of my property under the LLC structure, I'd shield my assets from probate costs when I eventually passed. The bank would see the backing and approve the loan. Then once the lawsuit resolved, management rights would revert to me, clean and documented. He made it sound like something I was doing for myself. I told them to come back Tuesday with the paperwork. I spent all of Monday convincing myself it was fine, that I had enough professional background to read anything they put in front of me, that I would catch anything irregular before I signed. I was right about that, and it made no difference. Tuesday morning, Todd arrived with a notary he introduced as Ferris, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, who said almost nothing and made no eye contact with anyone in the room. They spread the documents across my dining room table. I settled into my chair, put on my glasses, and started at page 1. The stack ran to 43 pages. I read the first 9 carefully. They outlined the formation of Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC, defined the scope of the asset management transfer, and laid out the estate tax protection rationale Todd had described Sunday night. The language was dense, but consistent with instruments I'd reviewed hundreds of times in my professional life. It matched what he'd told me. What I didn't account for was the particular kind of erosion that sets in when you are tired and grieving and want badly to believe that the people sitting across from you at your own kitchen table are exactly who you raised them to be. Dana had positioned herself at the corner of the table for the entire signing. She kept talking, softly, steadily, a low current of reassurance and gratitude that ran beneath the scratch of the pen. She talked about Louise. She talked about how relieved she was. She talked about how Todd had barely slept in a week. She talked about her older daughter's school play. She never stopped talking. On page 21, buried between 2 pages of standard LLC operational bylaws, was a document that bore no resemblance in language or purpose to anything surrounding it. It was a special warranty deed, conveying full legal title of my property to Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC, for a stated consideration of $10. I did not read it. I was already moving to page 22, my pen finding the next yellow tab, Dana saying something about how grateful she was, how this was going to change everything, and I signed my name and transferred my home without knowing I had done it. Ferris stamped it without speaking. Todd gathered the pages before the ink was fully dry. He shook my hand with both of his and told me I'd saved the company. They were out the door in under 20 minutes. I found out 11 weeks later. A Tuesday afternoon in January, and I was sorting through the mail at the kitchen counter when I came across an envelope from the Williamson County Assessor's Office. It was addressed to Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC, at my home address. I stood there and read the return address twice. Then I opened it. It was a tax assessment summary for the upcoming fiscal year. The listed property owner was Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. I sat down. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, the envelope in front of me, the afternoon light moving across the floor, and I did something I had not done since the week Louise died. I allowed myself for a few minutes to feel the full weight of what was happening, not the legal implications, not the professional analysis, just the plain human fact of what my son had done while sitting in my chair, drinking my coffee, saying his wife's name. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the Williamson County Register of Deeds online portal, the same database I'd used throughout my entire professional career, and ran a title search on my own address. 4 minutes. The results were unambiguous. A special warranty deed had been filed with the Register of Deeds, dated the Tuesday of the signing, conveying full ownership of my property from Harvey Cresswell, an individual, to Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. My signature was on it. So was Ferris's notarial stamp. I called Callum Briggs. Callum had been my closest professional colleague for 22 years. We'd certified together in the early days, consulted on contested appraisals, testified in opposing cases, and had lunch together afterward anyway. He'd gone back to Vanderbilt Law at 61, earned his J.D., and was now practicing real estate and fraud litigation in downtown Nashville. He was not a man who comforted you with maybes. I laid out everything I knew in under 10 minutes. When I finished, there was a pause. "Did you establish any kind of trust structure on that property after Louise passed?" he asked. I told him I had. I told him the name of the trust and the fiduciary. "Bring everything you have and come into my office tomorrow morning," he said, "because if what you're telling me is accurate, your son filed a fraudulent conveyance with the county on an asset you had no legal authority to convey. And I'm willing to bet he took that deed straight to a lender." I confirmed he had. The Register of Deeds records showed a deed of trust filed the same week, securing a credit line against the property. The lender was a federally chartered bank. Callum was quiet for a moment. "Harvey," he said finally, "this is federal bank fraud." I already knew. But hearing a lawyer say it out loud closed something inside me that had been sitting open since January. The next morning, Callum walked me through everything across his conference table. He had already pulled the county records himself. He found 2 things I hadn't caught. First, under Tennessee law, a notary certifying a real property deed is required to verbally confirm, aloud explicitly on the record, that the grantor understands they are executing a conveyance of ownership, not an LLC filing, not a management transfer, a conveyance. Ferris had not made that confirmation. His notarial certificate contained no such language. Second, Callum had cross-referenced Ferris's notarial commission number against the state registry. His commission had lapsed 8 months before the signing date. He was not a licensed notary in Tennessee when he stamped that deed. The notarization was defective. The deed, absent a valid notarial certification, could not be lawfully recorded under state law. It was voidable on procedural grounds alone. And then there was the trust. Callum set the 2019 trust instrument on the table and tapped the operative clause. "You cannot convey this property," he said simply. "You transferred the authority to do that to the corporate trustee in 2019. Your personal signature on a deed carries no legal effect. None." Todd filed a void instrument, presented it to a federally insured bank as valid collateral, and drew down a credit line against it. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "He didn't just defraud you. He defrauded the bank. And the moment he wired those funds, he crossed into federal territory." I told him I understood. I told him I wasn't ready to move yet. He studied me for a moment. "What do you need?" "A recording," I said. What followed was the part I'm least proud of, though I'd do it the same way again. Todd had been calling every week or two, easy and unhurried, the way a man calls when he thinks he's monitoring a situation that's fully under control. He'd offered to drive me to medical appointments twice. I accepted both times and used neither to gather what I needed. By the third time, I was ready. A licensed investigator, Callum, referred me to provided a small voice-activated digital recorder, no larger than a thumbnail drive, that could be concealed under a vehicle seat. She walked me through Tennessee's one-party consent law. As a party to any conversation occurring within the vehicle, I could record it legally. Todd drove me to a follow-up appointment on a Friday morning. The drive took 40 minutes each way. On the returned trip, Dana called through the truck's Bluetooth system. I kept my eyes on the road out the passenger window and let them talk. They talked for 11 minutes. Dana asked whether the second draw on the credit line had cleared. Todd confirmed it had, $340,000, bringing the total drawn to just over $800,000. She asked if there was any risk of me figuring out what had happened. Todd laughed. It was a short, flat sound, the kind that comes out when someone finds something genuinely not worth worrying about. He still thinks he signed an LLC document, he said. By the time anything shows up on his radar, the money is gone and we're 2 states ahead of it. He pulled into my driveway a few minutes later, walked me to the door, squeezed my shoulder, told me to rest up. I went inside and called Callum and told him we were ready. The 2 weeks between that phone call and the morning Todd showed up with his property manager, I played a role I am not proud of, but would play again without hesitation. I let voicemails accumulate. I asked Todd the same question twice in one call and absorbed the thin impatience he tried to hide. I mentioned to Dana that I couldn't remember where I'd left the title to my truck. I moved through my own house like a man whose edges were beginning to soften. Every instinct told me to confront him. The discipline required to hold back while your own son believes he has already buried you. I won't pretend that was easy. But it kept him from moving the money. It kept him confident. And confidence makes people careless in ways that prosecutors find very useful. So I drank weak tea and left my keys in obvious places and let my son believe his father was fading. And then the morning came. Callum had filed for an emergency injunction the day before Todd appeared in my driveway. When I called him after Todd's visit and said it was time, the response was already coordinated. 2 Williamson County Sheriff's deputies arrived first to serve the injunction paperwork. Behind them came a sedan from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Behind that, an unmarked black SUV from the FBI's Nashville field office, white-collar crimes unit. Federal jurisdiction had attached the moment Todd drew against a federally insured bank on fraudulent collateral. That wasn't a choice anyone made. It was automatic. Todd was still in my driveway when the first cruiser turned the corner. I watched from the window. He saw it, and his expression shifted, not fear yet, just the fast, mechanical look of a man calculating scenarios. He reached for his phone. He didn't get through. Dana arrived 20 minutes later. She must have driven fast. She came up the driveway and stopped when she saw the federal vehicles. She looked at Todd, seated on his tailgate with 2 agents reviewing documents beside him. She looked at me, standing at the top of my porch steps. I walked down. I didn't use the cane. I hadn't needed it for 2 months. I'd been carrying it for the same reason I'd been losing my keys on purpose. I stopped at the base of the steps. Dana looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before. It took me a moment to identify it because it was so unfamiliar. Genuine fear, not the kind she'd manufactured at my kitchen table back in October. The kind that lives behind a person's eyes when they finally understand that what they thought they'd escaped has been walking toward them the entire time. "Harvey," she said, very quiet. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Louise's name in her mouth that October night, the deliberate, surgical way she'd used it, pressing it against the exact place she knew would give. I thought about the herb garden. I thought about page 21. "You want to know what I did the afternoon that assessor's notice arrived?" I said. She didn't answer. I pulled up the county recorder's portal. 4 minutes. Todd's filing was right there. I held her gaze steady. I called Callum Briggs that same day. "You thought you were 2 states ahead of it, Dana." That's what Todd said in the truck. "You had a 38-day head start on a 64-year-old man you'd decided was too tired and too old and too broken by grief to look up from his coffee. Her mouth opened. The trust was established in 2019, I said. I have no legal authority to convey that property. I never did. The deed Todd filed is void on two independent grounds: a lapsed notary and the absence of grantor authority. The $800,000 he drew from that credit line is secured against an asset he can never lawfully hold. He presented a defective, fraudulent instrument to a federally insured institution. The recording from his truck has been with federal prosecutors for 10 days. An agent called Dana's name from the driveway. I turned and walked back up the porch steps. I went inside. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the rest of it unfold through the glass, without sound, the way you observe the end of something you've already fully understood. The criminal charges filed covered elder financial abuse, forgery, fraudulent conveyance, and federal bank fraud. Dana faced conspiracy charges for her role in structuring the credit draws. The FBI froze Whitmore Family Holdings LLC within 72 hours. Callum told me later that the federal bank fraud charges alone carry mandatory exposure that doesn't leave much room for negotiation. When spring came, Louise's herb garden grew back the way it always has. Basil first, pushing up through the soil she'd turned with her own hands 3 decades ago. Then the rosemary, then the flat-leaf parsley along the south edge. I sat on the wraparound porch she'd always wanted and drank my coffee, while the dogwood trees were blooming along the fence line. And the house was quiet in exactly the way it is supposed to be quiet. Mine, the same as it's always been. Some people have said I should have called Todd the minute I found that assessor's envelope. Confronted him, given him a chance to explain or recant before bringing in the law. A few people who've heard this story think that would have been the more decent thing to do. Maybe. But I spent 35 years in a profession built on a single discipline. The document does not lie, and the person who falsified it is counting on you to respond with your heart before your head. Todd was counting on his father's love to override his father's training. He was counting on grief and age and a desperate human need to still believe the best about your own child. He was almost right. I keep that word close, almost, because in the end that's the only margin that ever mattered.